Greetings temporal humans. This is Boudreaux, the cybernetic ghost from the future. Welcome to Season 1, Episode 9, of the Trailer Trash Terrors podcast. This is the last episode before the season finale. This episode is titled, McGurk's Suicide Hall and 100 Years of Anguish. Get ready to go on a trip back in time with Vic Hermanson. Please keep your hands, feet, trans-dimensional tentacle extensions, cerebral cortex, and temporal lobes inside the capsule at all times.
Trailer Trash
Hello everybody. Boy, I really like that Loco Lobo guitar. It just really does fit for a podcast of this type. But for right now, let's switch gears. What you're hearing is the first movement of Beethoven's Sixth Symphony. It's generally called the Pastoral. When I was a child, living in a tiny trailer in rural Louisiana, sometimes my mother would call me in, and she would play old 78 records she had of the Pastoral and a few other Beethoven symphonies. I came to love them. I came to think of them as little points of calm, little points of order, in an otherwise chaotic, noisy, hot, and often very frightening world. I can only assume that millions of people have found Beethoven to be equally soothing and equally instrumental in achieving a feeling of order and goodness. My understanding is that most composers during the time of Beethoven simply gave up on writing symphonies, feeling that Beethoven was so far ahead of the rest of the world that they just couldn't compete. As we moved away from Louisiana, the old 78 records were put in a drawer or in a closet, and the record player that would play them was put in that same closet. So Beethoven didn't disappear from my mind, but he wasn't a guest at our dinner table quite as often. So, when in the summer of 1973, I found myself sitting in a Tampa theater watching Soylent Green, I was a bit surprised to suddenly hear the tones of Beethoven's Sixth once again. They were associated with a scene of Edgar G. Robinson, lying down on a comfortable table in a cool, quiet room, watching beautiful scenes of nature around him, listening to Beethoven, and drinking poison, and willingly dying to escape the horrors of the Soylent Green world. Today, we would call that act assisted suicide. But I remember being absolutely overwhelmed by the idea of a brilliant man giving up his life for 20 minutes of quiet and cool, and comfort, and at least some feeling that somebody else cared about the end of his life. I attempted suicide when I was about 11 or 12. I wish I could remember the exact age. It was the morning after a severely abusive episode with my father, and I simply had no hope that the world could ever be different. I stood tall, my back next to the kitchen counter, a large butcher knife held to my chest, and fell forward onto the floor. In my mind, I would hit the floor, the butcher knife would go deep into my chest, and I would be no more. I hadn't thought through things beyond that. That's what a 12-year-old does. Luckily, when I hit the floor, my angles were wrong, my understanding of friction and viscosity were wrong, and the knife simply changed angles and skittered across the floor, giving me a very minor nick just in the skin of my chest. I was stupid and desperate and terribly immature, and I'm tremendously grateful that I didn't understand physics better. Because at that time, I really did not want to live any longer. How can there be any terror more visceral than that? So when I became aware that at least one time in the history of humanity, suicide became a source of entertainment, I thought that should be a Trailer Trash Terrors episode. So that's what tonight is about. It's about McGurk's Suicide Hall in New York, in the Bowery, a place where people only existed when their lives had become utter and total hell. It's also about the views of suicide in the 19th century leading up to McGurk's. It probably won't be a happy show, and Boudreaux will be quiet. There will be no smart-ass remarks from him. But it's an interesting topic, and it's a topic that I think deserves a show of its own. Let's go back in time to the 19th century and the existential and psychological horror of McGurk's Suicide Hall on the poverty and crime-ridden streets of the Bowery in New York. One of my favorite resources in preparing this podcast and things that I write, and simply in understanding the world, is newspapers.com. It's a resource that allows one to go back in time. I can go back to 1700 and read actual newspapers, page by page, paragraph by paragraph. What did people find important? How did they express their feelings? How did they see the world? How did they see their obligations to each other? And so today's first indication of the view of suicide in the 19th century comes from the Lancaster Intelligencer on July 23rd, 1800. Among the many instances which have lately excited public attention, there perhaps has been few, if any, where the object was more commiserated than that which is now our melancholy part of our duty to record. John Shermer, Esquire, late of Pump Court in the Temple, was the son of Mr. Shermer of South Lambeth, a gentleman of independent fortune and liberal sentiments, whose attention to the education of his children reflects great credit upon him. This son was bred to the bar, to which he was called in his 22nd year, and was distinguished for his legal qualifications and the friendship of the most eminent characters. The particulars of John Shermer's life are the same as you would read in any paper or magazine today. He was 27 when he fell in love with a girl that he met, going through the court system. He proposed to this girl. He approached her parents, and they rejected him, even though he was wealthy and in good standing in the community. The newspaper reads, "From that time he has been the prey of the most marked melancholy, till a few days ago, unable longer to bear the despair which results from the extinction of hope in a bosom agonized by passion, he appears to have resolved on sacrificing a life which presented to him nothing but misery." Now, when you read these old newspapers, S's, the letter S, they look much more like F's. There is a difference if you look at them carefully, but people of this century have to stop and say, okay, exactly what is that word? So if I mess up at all, it's because the S's look very much like F's. The paper describes how he was dressed when they found him. He was dressed in black, the copy of a will, and £1, 15 shillings, and 6 pence in cash was found in his pocket. He had taken the precaution of putting weights in his pockets, the more effective to accomplish his purpose. The article goes on to say that his brother, who was a lieutenant in the Navy, had just the month prior tried to save a sailor who had fallen overboard and drowned in the process. So, this family lost 2 adult sons in the course of 1 month. And here's where the world is different. At the end of the article, they say this: "Who will refuse the pitying sigh? What heart will not swell with the flow of sorrow? Hardened must be the soul of him who would not commiserate a parent's pangs. Who would not participate in sorrows like these?" And the only place that it says it comes from is Jamaica paper. News moved slowly back then, so who can know how long Mr. Shermer had been dead? I'm going to jump around the 19th century. At first I thought of going every 10 years, finding some article for 1800, 1810, and so forth. But I think that's more than is really needed to get the point across. So this article is from 1810, and it's from the United States Gazette for the country on October 25th, 1810. The article's headline, they didn't really do headlines, is simply "Suicide. On Tuesday morning last, on the turnkeys opening the cell door in Horsham Gaol of William Treby, one of the unhappy convicts sentenced to death at the last assizes, he discovered him in a kneeling posture near his bedside. On his wishing the convict good morning and receiving no answer, he approached him and was greatly shocked at finding that he was suspended by a sort of rope made of his handkerchief and neckcloth, which he had tied to the grating of his window, and that he was quite dead and stiff. Trouble was convicted at the assizes in March last of having issued a forged note of the Fordingbridge Bank, value 104 shillings, at Worthing's, but his sentence was respited for the opinion of the 12 judges. A number of letters were found in the pocket of the deceased, of which the following are copies and extracts. And here's something I've never seen in a modern paper. They go through these letters one by one. They talk about a letter to his son, they talk about a letter to his wife, and a letter to his fellow inmates. Here's one, just a part of one from his son. "Dear Tom, before I quit this life, which I am on the brink of doing, and you receive this shall be no more in this world and in the next, God only knows. I want to say a great deal to you, but as fast as one idea comes into my mind, another is gone. What I feel at this moment overpays years of enjoyment, and what I hope and trust you will never feel. What I wish to impress on you with my last breath is to love, honor, and virtue never deviate the true principles with which you have begun life, and you will be happy. I have taken notice of and admired several of your acts, wherein you have pleased me much. But beware of flattery. Let every transaction of life be strictly honest, and you need fear no one. Never let companions, nor anyone else, persuade you to what you think wrong yourself. Your own conscience will dictate to you, for no man ever did a bad action, but something within him told him he was doing wrong." I find these letters to be quite interesting and very, very sad. It goes on to tell him to avoid gaming and drunkenness, and to not hang around loose women. And then he talks about love your mother, love your sisters and your brother, and the Lord will bless you. This goes on quite a while. At the end of the letter, he says, "May the Almighty God bless you and protect you, in the fervent prayer of your wicked and miserable father." Man, I hope I never have to write a letter like that. Then he sends a letter to his wife. "My ever dear wife, for the last time I shall ever call you by that endearing name, forgive this act and accept my prayers for the happiness and prosperity of you and my dear family. May Almighty God protect and be a father to the widow and the fatherless, and guide you all in the paths of righteousness. And oh, may my errors be a warning to you all, not to neglect your religious duties. From the evil has sprung all my misery. Careless about God, I have run from one sin to another, till I have brought destruction upon myself and all you that are innocent. Could I carry away with me all the infamy I have attached to my dear family, my last moments would be much happier than they are. As it is, I hope God will provide for you all, My fate is what I have expected. Mr. Treble was almost 60 when he committed suicide. He had been a clerk, and obviously he wasn't terribly happy with his life. But he was going to be hanged for a financial crime, which apparently was something that was not all that uncommon in 1810. He writes another letter to his fellow inmates, telling them to accept their fate with more courage than he was able to put forth. I think it's interesting how deeply the papers go into this man's life, how much they tell you about the letters that he sent to his son, his daughter, his wife. They're very sad, and one can only imagine the feeling of despair that he had in that cell, realizing that his life was coming to an end, with sins that he considered to be unforgiven. So now we move to 1820, and I don't really like the idea of reading these articles straight up, but sometimes the language is such that I can't replicate the feel of the article without reading some of it. So this is 1820, December 28th, from the National Gazette. And just there in the middle of the page, it says, "Suicide. A melancholy circumstance took place the day before yesterday in the Botanical Garden. A person about 65 years of age, genteelly attired, was with several other people whose curiosity led them to the spot, looking at the bear Martin, lying in his kennel. The spectator suddenly seated himself upon the parapet, turned his legs inward, slid down the wall, and lay extended on the ground. The bear sprung from his kennel upon the unfortunate man, seized him by the neck, and choked him. The ferocious animal went twice round the den, holding his prey as he had seized it, and seemed to exhibit it to the horror-struck spectators, who uttered hideous cries. He then carried the body into his kennel, and soon came out again, dragging it by one of the legs. The people threw stones and turned dogs into the place, but they durst, I like that word durst, not advance. Some young persons called upon the sentinel to fire upon the beast. His piece was not charged. Besides, the man was dead. The animal was at length driven into his den, and the body taken out of the place. The unfortunate man had no papers in his pocket that could lead to a discovery who he was, but he has since been found to be a man in good circumstances." Okay, a couple of thoughts. First off, it's interesting to me how these old articles always tell you the circumstances, or frequently tell you the circumstances of the man. He was either a man of unquestionable dignity, or sometimes constant veracity, or even sometimes he was a man prone to spend too much time with the bottle. The other thing is, there was a guard there with a gun, with a rifle. It probably was too late to do anything, but in order to fire that rifle, he had to charge it. That means putting powder in the rifle, putting a ball in the rifle, packing all of that down, making sure the flint was in the right place, and then firing and killing this bear. So if you were of the mind to get into a bear pit in 1820, which was in Paris, and allow that bear to come and bite your neck, you were dead. Now, the question I have is, what would cause a person to opt for that much pain? I mean, think about it. You're jumping in this den with a bear. It's got huge teeth, huge claws. It's going to use those natural weapons upon your body. And for a while, it's going to hurt. A lot. It's not going to be instantaneous death. Maybe this is something along the lines of, there's honor in accepting the pain. I don't know. But once again, I find it interesting how they write this story. And the only place they say it comes from is the Paris paper. And the poor man who was killed by a bear was never identified, lost to history, except to the few people who knew him in 1820. Some of these articles give us a good idea of what they considered to be proper medical treatment at the time. This is from the Wyoming Herald, June 25th, 1830. There's no headline at all. It just says, Richard Crownshield Jr. hanged himself in his cell this afternoon. Mr. Brown, the jailer, at about 2:15, had occasion to go to the cell to speak to him, and on looking in to find him, saw him hanging. He immediately opened the door, and with the assistance of the turnkey, cut him down, and with all possible speed called several physicians. They opened a vein, and he bled freely, but all their efforts to revive him were ineffectual. A coroner's request was then held. The article goes on to say that he accomplished his purpose by tying 3 handkerchiefs together, and then tying his hands together behind his back. I'm not quite sure how one does that, but that's what the article says. There were 2 letters found in the cell with him, one to his father, one to his brother George, and the one to his brother George warns all young people to be admonished by his fate and to not pursue a life of vice. Richard was 26 years old when he died. His brother was in the adjoining cell. They apparently both had been involved in thievery. The article discusses how the humanity of the law prevents them from putting people in chains who have not yet been convicted, which kind of gives you the idea that they could be put in chains after they had been convicted. Their father apparently came to the jail and asked them if they wanted a new suit of clothing before their trial. The brother said yes. Richard said, "No, I don't believe it will be needed." So apparently he had some idea of what his plans were. The article then goes on to talk about how difficult it is to prevent prisoners from committing suicide. Even those prisoners placed in irons, it says, occasionally find a way to bring a premature end to their own lives. Have you ever heard the term mad as a hatter? Well, hatters did frequently go mad. They were working with felt, they were working with other materials, and they used mercury in the creation of these hats. Sometimes they suffered rather severe brain damage, and they went mad. This is from 1840. It simply says, "Melancholy suicide." A journeyman hatter named Daniel Welch, aged about 50, and in the employ of Messrs. Clapp and Cole, committed a suicide this morning at 6 o'clock by shooting himself with a pistol. The deceased was a foreman in the establishment of his employers and is represented by those working with him as having been in a very distressed state of mind for some days past in consequence of the separation from him a few weeks since of his wife and 4 children. Okay, so whether he was mad or not, or mentally deranged or not, or whatever term you want to use, essentially this man is bereft, sad, destroyed, deeply, deeply sad about the fact that his wife and his children are gone. This morning he entered the shop as usual and remarked to an apprentice, the only person at the time in the establishment with him, that he did not feel like going to work, and in an instant after, when he was unobserved, committed the fatal deed by discharging a loaded pistol into his breast. The unfortunate man is stated to have been mild and unoffending in his disposition and of temperate habits, and for the last 15 years to have been in the employ of Messrs. Clapp and Cole. An inquest was held over the body by Seth Pollard, Esquire, and the jury returned a verdict that the deceased came to his death by shooting himself with a pistol. There was a trade magazine called The Hatter and Furrier, and in the April 1881 edition, it talks about the death of William P. Cole, who, of course, was the Cole in Clapp and Cole. It says he was a model businessman, active, energetic, vigorous, and scrupulously correct in all his matters. Even here, it's interesting to see how they write the articles. During his whole business career of half a century, comprising the perilous times of 1837, 1861, and those of later times, he never failed to meet an obligation And during this long period, every man received from him the penny that was due. I think I'll skip 1850 and move on to the Sudbury Gazette, 1860, Saturday, July 30th. Sudbury is a small town in Pennsylvania, known for its very, very good newspaper. One of their scholars, one of their local teachers, had made a trip to the Orient, as they call it, and had visited Japan. Upon returning, he wrote about his travels and about the Japanese people. So there's a whole page article in here about their manufacturing, the nature of their people, the way they dress, the way they live, their food. And then there's a whole paragraph, a big paragraph, in this called their propensity to suicide. Let's hear some of this. Suicide is very common and is generally committed by cutting open the bowels by 2 gashes in the shape of a cross. It is tolerated, if not in some cases approved, by the laws. The criminal who thus anticipates execution secures the public sympathy and applause, saving his property from confiscation and his family from disgrace. Upon the death of superiors or masters, suicide is often committed as a mark of personal devotion and attachment. It is also common as a means of escaping disgrace or revenging an affront, where there appears to be no other resort. One of the more interesting paragraphs in this article talks about the sons of Japanese people of quality, civil servants, aristocrats. The sons of all persons of quality exercise themselves in their youth for 5 or 6 years, with a view that they may perform the operation in case of need with gracefulness and dexterity. These young men spend 5 to 6 years learning the sword, just as an American might learn to dance or to be a horseman or an athlete. They want very much, when that time may come, when the dispatching of their life might be necessary because of honor, to be able to do so without hesitation or lack of skill. He tells the story of 2 gentlemen in a courthouse. And to modernize, it has the feel of an urban legend. But here goes. It is related in illustration of this propensity to resort to suicide that 2 high officers of the court met on the palace stairs and jostled each other. One was an irascible man and immediately demanded satisfaction. The other, of a placable disposition, represented that the circumstance was accidental and tendered an ample apology, remarking that no other satisfaction could reasonably be demanded. The irascible man, however, would not be appeased, and finding that he could not provoke the other to a conflict, he suddenly drew up his robes, unsheathed his sword, and cut himself open in the prescribed mode. As a point of honor, his adversary was under the necessity of following the example. So, if we are to believe this to be a true account, that means there was a Japanese courthouse sometime in the 1850s, with 2 willfully disemboweled men dying on the stairs because one bumped into the other. In our society, we would see this as a sign of shared mental illness, as a tremendous tragedy, something that would require years and years of effort to overcome. Is the story true? Probably. But I think it's an extreme example, and I doubt that very many Japanese courthouses found themselves having to clean up from 2 disemboweled bodies on the stairs. This is a personal note. This doesn't come from a newspaper, it just comes from my mind. I figure I have seen somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 people die. That's a lot more than most people ever see. That comes from working in trauma centers. Included in that are a great many successful suicides. What was perhaps even harder to see were the unsuccessful suicides, of which there were a great many. I can't remember a single week of my career in emergency departments when I didn't see a 14 to 17-year-old young girl come into the ER, normally with her parents, just as yellow as she could possibly be. You see, a week or 10 days before, she had decided that she wanted to end her life, usually because of a jilted boyfriend or a friend who had said something unpleasant at school. Today, I assume it happens mostly because of social media, things that other friends say on their Facebook page. What she didn't understand was that the Tylenol is not harmless. It was, from the moment she took that huge dose, it was destroying her liver. If she was lucky, she threw up. Depending on how bad she felt, how much she itched, how much energy she had lost, how much nausea she had, how much pain she had, she would either come to the ER fairly quickly, in which case we could usually save her life, or she would come to the ER far too late, at which point the only thing that could happen would be a liver transplant. Well, as you know, livers are not easily attainable at Walmart or Target or any other place like that. But the wonderful thing about livers is that a healthy one has a tremendous capacity to grow and regenerate. So a living donor can be had. Normally a father, a mother, a sister, somebody who is genetically close to the patient needing the liver transplant. I wish I could say that every time I saw physicians go into the room and talk to the family about who would be willing to give part of their liver to this young girl who was going to die without it, that I saw 100% acquiescence. I saw 100% support, where mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers said, yes, of course, you can have part of my liver. I will regrow a new one, and then she will be able to live. But at least a quarter of the time, at least 25% of the time, what I saw was families saying, well, I don't think I want to give up half of my liver. I think she would probably destroy that one also. Those are painful moments to see. Those are moments that have built up over many, many years. And it meant that in a few weeks, a young girl was almost certainly going to be dead. Boys are more violent than young girls. At least they were when I was working in the emergency department. Boys tend to use guns. Shotguns, .22s, deer hunting rifles, whatever they can find. And a great many of them are successful. If a boy attempts suicide, there's a much greater chance that he will succeed than a young girl. However, many young boys don't really understand anatomy. They don't really understand angles. They don't really understand how much of one's head and face one can lose and still be alive. The worst thing that you would see would be a young man who put a shotgun under his chin, either angled directly upward or even slightly forward, and pulled the trigger. He would end up with his eyes gone, his nose gone, his sinuses exposed, pretty much his mouth being gone. Just imagine the entire front of someone's face torn away. They also found themselves fully alive, often not even unconscious. When those patients came in, we always knew exactly what was going on. There was no way to even tell what they were feeling other than the incredible trembling of their bodies. There was no way for them to respond to their mother or father. All you could hear was somewhat of a gurgling sound. By the time they got there, the paramedics had generally done the best they could to intubate what was left. They would place an endotracheal tube into the patient's trachea, at least assuring a clear and patent airway. But the problem was, this was a child who was healthy and strong and would probably live a very long time. I know I probably saw at least 20 young men who ended up with that particular fate. I've started large bore IVs on them. I've inserted Foley catheters. I've tried to change dressings for whatever was left. All the time one is delivering this care, you try not to look at their face. It's just something that my brain, and I think probably most human brains, do not want to encounter. So you look away. These young men will have dozens of surgeries in the future, at least something to give them a way of taking in nourishment, maybe communicating to a certain degree. But their lives will never be the lives of a young man again. We had one physician who was a brilliant man from England, and whenever we would have a suicide case, he would insist on using the diagnosis felio de se, which is medieval Latin, and it means essentially a felon against oneself, a felony against oneself. You see, in old British common law, old English common law, suicide was not just considered a tragedy, it was considered a crime. So there would be a trial, there would be an inquest, something to determine that this was indeed a suicide. What would happen then is the dead individual's property would be confiscated, it would return to the king, and they would be listed in the annals of England as a criminal, as a felon, as a murderer. We'll get to McGurk's in just a few minutes. It's worth waiting for. Believe me, it's not just clickbait. So we come to an article from the Daily Evening Telegraph, Philadelphia, Thursday, March 24th, 1870. The article is called The Philosophy of Suicide, and it's not really discussing any particular case. It's talking about how the relatively new scientific discipline of statistics might be used to better understand and to control suicide. It starts with, if there is one incident of the drama of human life that seems to be utterly lawless, wanton, and capricious, it is that of suicide. Remorse, love, melancholy, and rage are the agents to which we usually attribute acts of self-destruction, and all these human passions are thought to be above and outside laws and controlling authority. But an age, noted for its disposition to reduce all phenomena to empirical formulas, and which does not despair of expressing even the vital processes in chemical nomenclature, has laid hold on suicide and sought to subject it to stable laws. The article focuses on Professor von Ottingen and his field of ethical statistics. And the entire article is essentially talking about the fact that suicide is increasing all over the world, and it seems to be increasing at a relatively constant rate, no matter where one happens to look. Suicides happen more frequently in the hot summer months and less frequently in the cold winter months. The method of suicide is incredibly consistent all across Europe and even into the new United States. For instance, in France, for every 100 male suicides, 26 resort to drowning, 42 to hanging, 14 to shooting, 4 to stabbing, 6 to charcoal fumes, 2 to poison, and 6 to jumping from a height. If I were a better journalist, I would research what those numbers are today. But today we're looking at history and perception. The article ends as gloomily as any 2020's piece of clickbait. What it's talking about is that the statistics indicate a far more rapid growth in the incidence of suicide than the incidence of new people. Population is not increasing as rapidly as suicide. Here's how this delightful little article ends. Indeed, if the statistics are correct and prove what they seem to prove, there is a time in the remote future when the number of annual suicides on the earth will exceed the number of births. And still beyond that is a time when the process of self-destruction, going on at an annually accelerating rate, will have left but one human being on the planet, and he, with a rope around his solitary weasand, shall jump from a barn rafter and leave the unfortunate planet without any inhabitants at all. Boy, that's uplifting. In case you don't know what the word weasand means, It's an obsolete term referring to throat, neck, esophagus. Well, we know that the Earth has added several billion people since this particular article was written, so I'll place this in the category of 1870s clickbait. That's a few seconds of The Entertainer by Scott Joplin. If you owned a photograph, about 1900, that would be one of the records you could listen to. And it would sound just about like what you heard. Now our journey takes us to the Bowery. It was the section of New York that eventually became known as Skid Row, years after its heyday. But before then, it was the preferred home of what you might call the New York dregs of society. Plus, it was an incredibly popular tourist location. It seemed at the time that it was the thing to do to go see the poor, to go watch them in their natural environment. I say that with the greatest of sarcasm, but truly, that was something that New Yorkers enjoyed doing. Let's look at a London newspaper from March 5th, 1898. The paper is the Illustrated Police Gazette. Man, it's a lot of fun to read. Each newspaper, each edition started with the first page with these incredibly garish illustrations of elephants burning and crimes being committed and wars and other illustrations of human strife. The term, "if it bleeds, it leads," certainly applied to the Police Gazette. The article says, "A wonderful pennyworth." While the question of the housing of the poor remains a matter of considerable moment, the fact that a meal and a night's lodging can be obtained for a penny in New York and yet leave the proprietor a profit is worth noting. This is in Division Street on the Bowery, and contrary to expectation, the place is bright and clean, while two large stoves keep it warm and comfortable even on the coldest nights, for they are never allowed to go out. Having paid his penny, the guest seats himself at a long table, and a waiter brings him a bowl of beef stew with coffee and a bun, or a plate of pork and beans with the coffee and bun, while the 2.5-penny regular dinner consists of soup, roast chicken, tea, coffee or milk, and a piece of pie can be obtained. The men sleep on the floor and on the benches, and for another penny, they can get breakfast in the morning. There's probably nothing all that amazing about that particular story, or even that particular place. What is amazing is that the view of the world at the time was that, hey, this is a good deal. These guys are really getting something good. You get to have a bowl of stew or something, and you get to sleep on the floor, all for a penny. What a deal. I think that starts to get across the idea of what the Bowery was like between the years of, say, 1890 and 1910. It was a place of incredible poverty, great pain, massive crime, and a place where there were clubs, nightclubs, places of entertainment, bars that people from all over New York sought out. Maybe the most notorious of these actually was called the Mug, and it was at 295 Bowery. It was opened in 1895. It wasn't long, however, before it started to be called McGurk's Suicide Hall. What a name that is! Why was it called that? Because it became known as the place where young women, mainly prostitutes, an occasional man, would go to commit suicide. They committed suicide largely by drinking poison, specifically carbolic acid, in their beer. John McGurk owned a number of dives along the Bowery, but this was the most notorious. The bartender at McGurk's was called Shortchanged Charlie. And with that name, I guess you can figure out what his specialty was. He also had the specialty of putting drops of chloral hydrate in the drinks of unsuspecting customers. So the customer would fall asleep, sometimes fatally, and the waiters would relieve him of his excess cash and often his outer clothing. It was a place where female pickpockets were welcome. It was understood, though, that they had a set of rules they had to live by. If a patron caught a woman picking his pocket, she had to immediately give back whatever she had taken and leave the establishment immediately. She could come back later. She just had to make sure that no particular negative impact would happen to McGurk's. The bouncer at the club was named Eat-em-up Jack McManus. Eat-em-up Jack was a just-retired boxer and was considered the absolute authority within McGurk's. One simply did not cross Jack McManus without expecting something terrible to happen. McManus outlasted McGurk's. He died in 1905 by, what else? Murder.
Newsflash from the Pittsburgh Press, 29 May, 1905. Eat-em-up Jack McManus is dead. Peace be to his ashes. He was known also as McManus the Brute. He was bouncer at McGurk's Suicide Hall in the Bowery for years, and what he did to disturbers in that vast classic resort would have been a shame if the victims had not usually deserved all they got and more. McManus was a fighting animal. That was about all, for it does not appear, even from the most flattering of the obituaries uttered by his friends on the East Side, that he ever shone in art, literature, or any other of the gentler lines of endeavor to which great men sometimes turn. But Lord, how McManus could fight. He had been holding his end up in one of those East Side feuds which flourished so gloriously during the activity of Monk Eastman, before the monk sequestered at Sing Sing, and it is believed by the police that he had killed his man on the very night before he came to his own end. But McManus could not stand against a length of gas pipe as long as your arm when it was laid on the back of his head with all the force of a muscular assailant. The fellow who stole up behind McManus in the dark early yesterday morning laid on the gas pipe to fracture the skull it hit. And the skull of McManus was fractured all right, so that he died in Bellevue a few hours later. With two members of the fighting Bowery gangs killed within 24 hours, there is reason to hope that these roughs will soon dispose of themselves, in Kilkenny cat fashion, to the comfort of decent people in Manhattan, particularly those who do business and live on the East Side.
The more I read about McGurk's, the more it feels like a more brutal version of the Inn of the Thénardiers in the play and book Les Miserables. Everything in the establishment was designed and put in place to remove as much money from the patrons as possible. If that included removing their life, that was okay too. There was a particularly brutal type of prostitution that was prominent in the Bowery during these days. It involved often murderous pimps, absolutely ruthless in their desire to use women to make money, women who were helpless, had nowhere else to go, had no resources to turn to, and thus were at the absolute mercy of the pimps. McGurk accommodated this practice by renting out the upper floors of the suicide hall to pimps. Girls would go out in the streets, find clients, bring them back to McGurk's, finish their business, and head back out to the streets almost immediately. These women were often denied food, denied contact with any family they might have, beaten brutally, and over several years, many of them decided that the better action would be simply to take their own lives. At least 50 of them did. Some historians say closer to 100. Showing the ever so admirable qualities of mankind, word of these multiple suicides got out. And pretty soon, business at McGurk's increased greatly by people coming there simply hoping to see some woman removed from the club who had taken something that would almost certainly end her life. I found an article in the Brooklyn Times-Union from 1901. It says, "Girl wanted to die, ran away from home twice, and said she could not live without her sweetheart." Annie Shear, 17 years old, of 646th Street, Manhattan, attempted to commit suicide early this morning by swallowing carbolic acid. She was taken a prisoner to Bellevue Hospital. The girl ran away from her home last January, and her father, Samuel Shear, a clothes cutter, made a vigorous search for her. He found that she had been frequenting McGurk's Suicide Hall on the Bowery, Manhattan, but she was induced to return home and go to work in a shop with her father. She went away again recently, and when brought back, she told her father that she could not live without her sweetheart. In another article, the sweetheart is designated as Bad Max Ketchum, who, of course, was the Bowery pimp. It's a bit surprising to me that we don't see more deliberately attempted suicides on TikTok and other video platforms. Another article from 1899 says, 2 young women, by agreement, drink carbolic acid in McGurk's, notorious resort. One dies, and the other may live. Anyway, 2 young women drank beer laced with carbolic acid in plain view of the 150 or so people there in McGurk's. The waiters and bouncers, made deft by long experience, quickly drag the pain-maddened victims through the dark hallway into the street and drop them in a nearby hallway. Men dragged them back to the sidewalk and laid them there. So, McGurk's didn't particularly care that you were killing yourself. They just didn't want you to die there. An ambulance took these 2 women to Bellevue, where an antidote was administered. One died anyway, and one apparently would survive. It says, Suicide Hall is a long, plainly plastered room in the rear of what a gaudy electric sign announces as John McGurk's Sporting House, 295 Bowery. The hall proper is reached through swinging doors, and in it are ordinary round tables, chairs, and a jangling piano. During the day and in the early hours of the evening, it is quiet enough, but early after midnight it awakens. Every table is crowded by sailors on leave, the men of the Bowery, and women of all description. Some of the women are young, but all are vice-hardened. Suicide Hall, as it has been known for years, woman after woman has been thrown out of there dying from self-administered poison. The young woman who succeeded in ending her life was known as Madge Davenport, and it is said she first came to the city during Dewey Week. The other gave the name of Mamie White, 21 years old, and said she lived at 1023 East 165th Street. The activities at McGurk's even took on the status of a morbid game. Today, on TikTok, it would be something like the Suicide Challenge. Here's from another article in 1900. McGurk's is known as Suicide Hall for the reason that many women have taken poison therein and then staggered into the street to die. The women frequenters have an organization known as the Suicides Club, and their favorite poisons are carbolic acid and Paris green. By a tacit understanding between them, when a woman takes poison in McGurk's, she immediately leaves the place and endeavors to reach an elevated railroad pillar at the Bowery and First Street, where she expires unless an ambulance reaches her before the poison has accomplished its work. For this reason, the pillar in question is known as Suicide's Post. It is estimated that 15 women have committed suicide in his resort since McGurk has been conducting the place. This was only a few years into its existence. Last week, 3 swallowed poison in his dive, and this week, another attempted her life. But McGurk's is only one of many and is merely cited as an example. The Bowery is much worse than Chinatown, but there is to be no attempt to change its topography or purify its surroundings. What was happening at the time was that New York very much wanted to get rid of Chinatown, which was directly adjacent to the Bowery. McGurk was well connected politically and could easily bribe police chiefs, city officials, even mayors. He was very much part of the Tammany Hall group. A few years later, he decided he had made enough money. He had collected somewhere around $300,000, retired to California, and became known as a gentleman. In case you wondered, Paris green was a paint pigment, an inorganic paint pigment that became one of the first insecticides and rodent poisons in the U.S. It also killed humans very well, very painfully, and in a fashion brutal enough and gruesome enough to attract whole crowds of onlookers. So, thus ends the long, sad, tragic story of McGurk's Suicide Hall. My gosh, this podcast has gone on for at least an hour. It's an hour of unrelenting sadness, tragedy, unhappiness. Okay, I suppose I can accept that. After all, this is Trailer Trash Terrors. And this is probably the only show of the series that's really delved down into genuine human terror. That existential terror of the soul that just can't be denied. I have an eidetic memory, or at least something very, very close to an eidetic memory. That means that I have an ability to remember things that's far beyond normal. I can remember conversations, trivial conversations, I had 40, 50 years ago, down to the word. I can remember smells, I can remember visual things with incredible clarity. I can read books, just looking at the book in my mind, not remembering the plot. It's a benefit, it's a useful thing. But it creates a situation where nothing ever feels like it happened a long time ago. Everything is kind of part of this perpetual present. Of course, that's a very good thing, in that there are wonderful memories that are an absolute joy to go back and relive. But on the other hand, every day of my life since then, I have eidetically seen the dirty kitchen floor coming up toward my face. I have felt the slight nick of a knife not held correctly cutting my chest. I've heard the skittering of that butcher knife across the kitchen floor. I remember the physical events, of course, but perhaps even more than that, I remember the state of my mind when lying on the floor with a small amount of blood on my shirt, realizing that, my gosh, I'm still alive. I must have done something wrong. I better not try that again. Why in the world did I do such a thing? What was happening in my mind that put me in a state where I was genuinely willing to sacrifice my own life? I have my ideas, but they don't really matter. Even today, like most people, I know the meaning of despair. I have 2 sons. The younger one is a brilliant young man who's incredibly good at math, funny, kind, but for some reason now, for 6 months, a year, he essentially has had no desire to be a part of my life at all. In fact, he seems aggressively interested in me not being a part of his life. I don't know why. I've asked him. I don't get an answer. He says he's not ready to give me an answer. Okay. Well, all I can do there is say there must be some tremendous hurt within him that I hope one day heals. I do not regret the fact that I spent almost my entire adult life trying to make his life as good as I could make it. I would do that again. That's a father's job. I do one day hope that despair can slip away with answers and some degree of reconciliation. I love my son with every bit of my being, and that will never change. I've seen my career essentially fall apart completely. Years and years and years of effort simply slipping away in a relatively short period of time. I see a world that every day makes less and less sense to me. It feels, if I'm going to be honest, as if God is withholding His grace from the world. Sometimes I wonder if the Bowery felt that way, as if this is a place where the love of God doesn't quite penetrate. Like most people, I have a tremendous number of faults. I love cakes and cookies and candy way too much. I procrastinate. I go to the gym, but I don't spend as much time there as I should. I don't always tell the people whom I love that I love them as much as I should. I get lost in thought many, many times. And even though I don't fear death, I don't see death as the enemy. I sure as all hell see suicide as the enemy. There's just a part of me that is rebellious enough to say, no, you're not going to get me, and you're not going to get anyone else whom I love, or whom I can help, or whom I can save. You are a destructive bastard, and I will do everything in my power to fight you. Perhaps I should feel bad for depressing everyone who hears this show to pretty much an extreme degree, and I think it's probably time to call things to an end. If there's a problem, if you feel the draw of your life coming to an end at your own hand, please call someone. Please get help. Call the National Suicide Hotline. That number will be coming up in a few minutes. If you need to, send me an email at trailertrashterrors@gmail.com. Tell me you need to talk. Give me a phone number to call. I'll call you. I will talk to you. I'll talk to you as long as I need to. I'll help you any way I possibly can. I've been there. I know how it feels. And with my bizarre memory, I can draw up that moment, that time of despair, that time of terror, any time I want. Okay, this is Trailer Trash Terrors, Season 1, Episode 9, signing off.
Remember, help is available. Speak with someone today, anyone. Just reach out. The number for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is 800-273-8255. They are always available.
Trailer Trash Terrors is a labor of love, and it is written and produced by me, Vic Hermanson. The music you heard was provided by Loco Lobo and Smart Sound. All other clips are used under the protection of the Fair Use Doctrine. I would appreciate it greatly if you could leave a rating and review, hopefully a good one, wherever you listen to the podcast. I would appreciate it even more if you would contact me, trailertrashterrors@gmail.com. This has been the weirdest show I've ever done. It may be the weirdest show I ever do. But remember, whatever life throws at you, just find that place inside of you where you say, you know what? I'm stronger than you, and I will beat that bastard down. Trailer Trash Terrors, signing off. Bye-bye. One of my favorite podcasts always has a secret story after the end of the podcast. So it's kind of a little treat. You stick around and you get to hear one more story. Well, I'm going to top him. You get to hear 3. Totally unrehearsed and added at the very last minute, just because I thought it was a good idea. 3 more stories surrounding some aspect of suicide. First off, I was working in the medical ICU of a large hospital in Houston, and we had a young man brought in, very, very muscular, tall, strong African man. He must have been 6'6", and he was built like Arnold Schwarzenegger. He had ingested something at work, some industrial chemical that had immediately put him into a very deep coma, and I'm pretty sure it did cause some organ damage. But he started to come out of his coma. What had happened was that they had 2 refrigerators in his shop. One was for food, and one was for industrial chemicals that needed to be refrigerated. Somebody put the wrong chemical in the wrong refrigerator. He reached in thinking he was getting some water, took several big swigs of this, and suddenly found himself in a coma. He was in a coma for almost 2 days. I was taking care of him, and as soon as he started to come out of this, even a little bit, he could hear us speaking in the room. And we were saying, I wonder why he tried to commit suicide, because that was what the paramedics felt. That's what we felt. And whenever we would use the word suicide, he would absolutely buck and hit up against his bed. And finally, he held his hands up and he asked us he made the motion like he was wanting to write. That's a pretty common thing in ICU. So we gave him some paper and he wrote in big, emphatic letters, "No suicide, no suicide, no suicide." He wanted us to know. And I was really happy to hear that. Of course, it didn't change the way I cared for him. I did the very best I could to keep him alive, and I did. Or we did. The entire team that was working on him. But I was glad that our initial perception was wrong. The second story can't be described as anything other than just utterly tragic. I would work in ER and in critical care, and I had followed a young man, one of the young men who had blown the front of his face off with a shotgun in the attempt to commit suicide. He had really done very little damage at all to his brain. I'm fairly certain this young man is no longer alive. I'm pretty sure sinus infections, other infections of his cranial cavities finally took care of him. But he also was in ICU. They had done enough surgery to get some kind of covering over a large part of his face. His lower jaw was gone. Much of his upper face was gone, his nose, both of his eyes. And he could not, of course, articulate words. His vocal cords were still attached, active, and present, so he could make gurgling sounds. And over a few days, I kind of learned which gurgling sounds meant what. And he also would hold his hands up, ask for something to write with. I finally got him a tablet and a pen. He had no eyes, so he could not see what he was writing. But in an uncertain hand, he wrote, "Can you please kill me?" how do you describe what you feel when you take a tablet from a young man who, a week earlier, had been dating and playing football and aggravating his sister and running and jumping and laughing, and you see that their face is gone and they're asking you to kill them? I can't describe that particular moment, but it was among the saddest things I had ever experienced up to that time. The third story is one that is both sad and makes me very, very proud. My older son is a tremendously sensitive young man, brilliant, funny, very, very innocent. A friend of his, maybe not quite a friend, and acquaintance, at school went through a breakup and parked his truck in a gas station, and while the police were trying to find him because he had stolen a gun and taken it to school, he shot himself in the head there in that pickup truck, killing himself instantly. That's tragic. My sons and I made t-shirts to try and commemorate his life. Well, my son received a photograph of this young man standing next to a race car. And even though this was 12, 14 years ago, he still carries that photograph with him everywhere he goes. Every time he moves to a new home, a new apartment, in college, a new dorm room, wherever he was, he would take that photograph with him. And the reason he takes it with him is, he said, I just want to make sure that he's never forgotten. He was telling me about a French novel he read, and I have forgotten the title, where human souls were stuck in this place of darkness and cold, and the only time they felt any happiness, any connection at all to reality, was when someone on earth remembered them lovingly. That's the kind of son I have. I'm pretty damn proud of him. Okay, next week, there will be a happier show, I promise you.